Welcome everybody to the second edition of The Extra Edge, where we like to discuss all things improvement. As ever, I am joined by Murray McMillan, Operations and Production Excellence Guru, and Tim Wigan, who is Head of Exceeds Performance Improvement and is also a guru. Like all of you, things have been a little bit different for both of them over the past few months, when subjects such as how to maximise efficient production or performance of any person or any item, it should really be key when times are tough, but in reality, I think that actually takes a bit of a backward step as companies strive to cope with the day-to-day situation that's thrown at them. So bearing that in mind, Murray, good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Let's start off with you just now. Bearing in mind what I've just said about things being different and difficult in 2020, in your opinion, how have business leaders approached the challenges of the year so far? And from your perspective of operations and production excellence, do you think they've been more willing to engage with outside help or less likely to as they deal with the ramifications of a global pandemic?
It's a nice, easy one to start off with. I think in general we're seeing a bit of a mix. Certainly, and thinking back to March, April, which seems like a long time ago, certainly the impression I got at the time was there was a fair bit of not quite panic, but people were certainly just almost like shut down. People went into survival mode. How do we get through this with people working remotely, people working from home, all the restrictions on getting guys offshore or out to assets. So that was a massive issue. And I think, like you said there, Rachel, the reality was certainly what I felt was production improvement stuff took a bit of a backseat. That was definitely a case for a while. The focus was very much on costs. Everybody was desperate to cut costs, and I guess see a way forward. Thinking back to that time, the oil price had cratered again. It was pretty low. A lot of stuff was getting cancelled. A lot of things were changing. So I think probably given the uncertainty at the time, it wasn't unexpected. But definitely all of that took a back seat. I think as time's gone on and over the summer when things started to improve a little bit, that came back. We saw a lot more, well, not a lot more, some more interest in production enhancements. And I would say that's continuing even now. I think as we're probably all resigned to the fact we're in this sort of mode until the spring. At least we've got vaccines on the horizon by the looks of it. But I guess this is going to be reality till the spring, I would assume. But we are starting to see more activity coming back. I think there's now a reality that we've just got to get on. We've got to continue. Tim will probably talk about this in a minute. You're seeing a little bit more wells and drilling activity. Things are just starting to get going. Perhaps not everything. A bunch of stuff that's probably still either cancelled or postponed for a while. But definitely a change. But I guess what we're trying to do with clients we're engaging with just now is it's actually a very good time to talk about improvements. So even if you're not necessarily doing any big projects, it's almost the perfect time. You've got some less activity in general going on. It's a great time to get after some of these small improvements that you probably should have been doing for a while. It's also a really good way to engage the teams around you. Typically for me, this feedstock for improvements, or people are a little bit frustrated, things that have been driving you crazy for a while. Here's a chance actually to get after them. And it doesn't have to be big or expensive or particularly sort of limiting to the business. These things can go on almost like drip feeding. Small improvement projects could be going on right now across the board.
I guess for some companies, maybe that's an opportunity to try it just now, and as you say, in a more sort of limited sense, with a view to, right, okay, we get our blueprint for how that works for our company, and then roll it out when things really start getting going again. It's a kind of safer way to do it if they're a bit, uncertain about it.
Absolutely, and I guess a lot of people will have an experience that sometimes these type of change initiatives are fairly big, fairly large scale. It doesn't have to be that way. And actually seeing more and more people just now where this working from home, and I know most operators just now are still not in the office, they're still all working from home. That's actually a great opportunity to do some improvements. It's a great opportunity to sit with your team now, it's been like this for a while. We know it's going to stay this way for quite a bit longer. What can we do to make it better? What can we do to make it more efficient, more enjoyable? And it just make it easier, as well as anything out at the assets or offshore. Same thing for the office staff. Same things for people that are now having to work from home.
Okay, so that's my ignorance, because I was thinking production and operations excellence, there's going to be an element of office-based work there, but the majority of that's going to have to be almost practically played out, offshore. So what's the kind of the percentage, the ratio between what you can do plan-wise onshore versus what then happens offshore?
Percentage-wise, not entirely sure. I mean, you're right, the bulk of it will actually be offshore. The vast majority will be offshore, but you're always looking for onshore support. And the other reality is, when people are not offshore, they're on the field break, they're on leave, that's no reason not to keep engaging them, keep getting these ideas. I mean, certainly my experience over the years with people that work out there, they don't switch off 100%. When they come home, they're still thinking about all these little ideas, all the things they could change. Plus, you've got all your onshore teams as well, who are having to work differently at the moment. But actually, one or two of the operators I've spoken to are finding better links with offshore, because everybody's now working remotely. Everybody's all working like this, on Zoom or Teams or whatever. It's becoming a little bit more accepted, and it's now easier to have these kind of discussions with offshore. So for all it may be hard for people like myself to get offshore at the moment, to go and engage them in the more traditional way, it doesn't mean you can't do it like this. And one of the upsides, one of the things we've done in the past, is actually means you can phone into the guys in the control room or the guys offshore in an evening. I used to find when I did this stuff offshore, night shift was usually the best time to get things done. You didn't have any interruptions from the beach. You could actually sit with the guys and get some proper work done and chat things through. That can still happen. I'm quite happy. I've done it in the past. You can sit here and chat to the guys offshore or on their asset, wherever they are.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I guess the way we communicate has changed entirely, and you're right, it's kind of leveled it out in a way, so that we don't all necessarily feel we have to be on the spot to have that communication, because we can't. And it might have felt really odd 8 months ago, but it's very quickly become the norm, hence what we're doing right now.
Absolutely, and I think one of the nice things that both Tim and I have, we've both got a significant amount of experience, about 20 odd years working offshore. So it's not like it's an alien environment. You know the kind of thing. So when you're chatting to the guys remotely like this, it still makes a lot of sense. You can still have a fairly educated discussion with them about things.
Yourself in their absolute context, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think it just reassures them that you've been there, you've done that, you've got an idea what you're talking about. For example, there was one came up last week where we're talking about actually some fabric maintenance stuff offshore, and one of the issues was corrosion under insulation. It's a fairly big issue across the whole of the North Sea. And it's actually one of the things I always look for when I'm offshore, or even on an onshore plant. You've typically got, you've got your pipes, you've then got some insulation cladding on top of that, and you've then got a protective kind of metal cover, thin sort of aluminium cover over the top of it. One of the things I always look for is the footsteps, the dents in this, because it's always a little, because you shouldn't stand on it. It's a bit of a given, you should not stand on this stuff, but people do. And it's then always a little clue as to why are you standing on this? And more often than not, it's because they're trying to access a valve or a test point or an instrument or something. Sometimes it's just a shortcut to get through from one area to another. They know they shouldn't do it, but you still do. And for me, it then becomes a feedstock for, well, why are you doing this? Oh, I've got to reach this valve. Okay, so how else could we do this? We could make we could fabricate a simple step up. Fantastic, let's do that. So there's all these little simple things, you're looking for clues, but again, same as Tim, you've got the experience, you've been there, you can ask them these questions, they can send you photos, they can show you stuff and talk about it. So again, I think that experience helps, even though we can't physically get there right now.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I guess maybe you've done some of those things in the past as well, so you know what to look out for. No.
Funnily enough, that's actually the reality. Most of the very best people I've worked with offshore or in refineries and such, like the very best people for improvement ideas, have caused a lot of the issues. They've been there, done that, they've caused them, or they've done that thing that they know they shouldn't do for X number of years. But they're pretty honest about it and open about it, and they know how to improve it.
Yeah, yeah, they don't necessarily practice what they preach. Very good. So Tim, I think that's more the ops side of things, production excellence. You've been more engaging with individuals' performance, I guess, over the past few months. How have you seen it change? Has it changed for you?
Good question, Rachel. It's great to be back on this Extra Edge podcast. Always enjoy chatting with you and Murray. It's interesting how 2020 has evolved. We've seen, we talked about this at the last podcast, the deer in the headlights, a little bit of waiting to see how things panned out, a realization perhaps that we were going to be in this COVID lockdown restricted period for an extended period of time. How has that affected people? You ask, on an individual level, people have coped in different ways. So coping mechanisms is an interesting one to unpack. So individuals and teams have considered different coping mechanisms. A coping mechanism that I've seen work pretty well is to get productive and collaborative and make progress, even if it sometimes feels that that progress is not necessarily generating revenue or generating an immediate and obvious return. So it might be a longer term investment, progressing towards something that might only return in 21 or 22. We talked about sharpening the saw, helping the team and individuals improve their skill set. And so that's part of it. So individually and from an organizational perspective, we've seen different coping mechanisms for sure. The adoption and adaptation to digital and to platforms like Teams, Zoom, video conferencing, I think we'd all agree that over the last several months, we've become much more familiar with this, and picking up on some of what Murray was saying, I think it's really become a massive enabler. The comfort that people have now got with video conferencing and just being able to dial into someone else and ask questions and actually see them face to face, and the impact that that can have between on and offshore teams, between head office and frontline teams, is potentially significant. Before it was perhaps a bit of a point of resistance or a blocker, particularly for individuals that were not, IT savvy or perhaps a little bit anxious about using some of the digital platforms that we have. I think this lockdown situation in 2020 has perhaps forced an embracing of what there is to enable us to collaborate. And now that it's become a lot more familiar, I'm finding that at both an individual, social, and organizational, professional level, people are much more willing to spontaneously dial up someone else via video conferencing and ask questions and engage on a challenge to identify a solution. I think that's a really good thing. Obviously, we've got to be careful about not overusing it or intruding to the point where it becomes a nuisance. And, let's face it, that's not that different to the old normal, where you could barge into someone's office too often and actually become a nuisance and an interference and a distraction. So the discipline around interference, interruption still applies. But I think from a positive perspective, the experience and acceptance that we're seeing with video conferencing and virtual collaboration is really starting to open up new opportunities and to open our eyes to better collaboration. And yeah, Murray talked about being able to communicate from onshore to offshore to frontline teams. I personally think that we're now really going to see over the next year the opportunity to optimize that and use, for example, headsets which have a video camera where a frontline engineer is on a drill floor or on a production floor somewhere and is facing a challenge and can actually switch on the wearable technology, communicate with the engineering team onshore or at the head office. They're both seeing the same thing. The tech might have his hands on the issue and is getting some guidance or collaborative confirmation about what the problem is and how to solve it. Yeah, just thinking that as we've pivoted to this new virtual collaborative normal, we're potentially going to see the benefits of that going into 2021.
Yeah, that would have a massive impact on all sorts of industries. Yeah, not just offshore. I mean, that's an incredible thought, actually. That will change things, I would imagine, in a step change kind of way. That's a sea change, isn't it, for all sorts of remote working. But, and here's a question for both of you that occurred to me whilst you were talking about that, and I was kind of laughing when you were talking about dialing up people randomly, and it's like barging in an office. But the difference was, I was thinking most people don't sit in their pajamas in an office,
Yeah,
but they might be
yeah.
sitting in their pajamas at home, and that might be a bad thing or a good thing. But more than that, have you come across, because I haven't in my work, have you come across anybody or any particular groups of people who are really almost unwilling to engage with this kind of digital way of improving performance or operations? Has anybody really pushed back on it for you?
I'll maybe go with that first. I'm not aware of people that have pushed back completely. I have been in a number of meetings over the last couple of months where some people are still reluctant to put the video on. They'll quite happily talk in a meeting and you've got their initials up on the screen. I much prefer being able to see people. You know, it's a bit like being in a proper meeting room with them. And I think it's one of the things Tim touched on. The fact, you know, a while back this was quite alien. I know I used to find it quite uncomfortable being in a video meeting. You're not quite sure what to do with your hands and where to look and what to do. It's become very normal now. But I am still seeing a number of people that will quite happily have the video off.
That's because
it's become
pajamas.
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
But you know, it makes such a difference. I think when you can actually see somebody and you can, you know, see the facial expressions, see whether they're engaged or not engaged, makes a big difference. So I tend to challenge and say, look, would you mind? I hadn't thought about the pajama thing right enough, but would you mind putting your video on? It makes it much easier for all of us.
Yeah, it's human nature. You want to see somebody's face. What about yourself, Tim?
Yeah, definitely there's some reluctance, I've noticed, to collaborate virtually and via video. Agree with what Murray said. Often there's an initial reluctance to share video camera. It's just audio. And I tend to go, you know what, that's often good enough. That's actually still fine for a conversation. And it's amazing that we can protect ourselves from the virus, which has been the reason for the lockdown this year, whilst still communicating comfortably over the internet. I also agree that if it's an attempt at virtual team building, it's quite important to turn on the video camera, and irrespective of what you're wearing, you know, just zoom in on the face, you know, because putting a face to the name and seeing a smile, it goes a long way towards building trust and rapport and virtual camaraderie. It's quite topical actually, because one of the things that we have pivoted towards over the last 6 months has been virtual DWOPs. So drilling a well on paper, typically done in a conference setting, in a hotel conference room, with breakout rooms where the teams would go to discuss different parts of the program. We realized at the beginning of the year that this was an area where the teams that we support, typically drilling teams, but applies exactly the same to production and operation teams, they're looking often for objective external expertise to come in and help guide them and take a lot of the burden away from them in terms of pulling the team together during the readiness period for an execution phase, for an operation, or for a forthcoming work scope. And given that we know that this was a need from clients and part of our value proposition, we needed to find a way to do this effectively in the new virtual world. So over the last 6 months, and you guys have been part of the journey with me, we've explored different platforms. We've endeavored to understand what platform works best for which purpose. And using Microsoft Teams over the last few months, Rachel and Murray, we have offered virtual drill the well on paper sessions for several different clients, and we continue to do so, and we learn every time. And it's interesting, certainly during the presentation sessions, people are often encouraged to keep their video camera off, and I think that's probably fair because the focus is on the screen being shared and on the content on the screen. And we realized that there are a number of advantages over the face-to-face setting doing the virtual. For example, we've realized that in the old way, you'd often have people at the back of the conference room that couldn't really see the screen because it's 20, 30 meters in front of them. They can't quite make out the detail because sometimes the projectors are not the best. In terms of the acoustics, people sometimes can't hear exactly what's going on at the back of a real conference room, whereas in a virtual setting, screen is easy to read because it's in front of you, and with a headset or even without a headset, you can hear pretty comfortably what's going on. So there's one of the advantages. When we go into the breakout sessions, and that was one of our concerns pivoting to a virtual setting, was, well, how do you simulate that and repeat that in a virtual environment? But of course, these platforms like Teams, like Zoom, and many others have digitally pivoted and evolved so quickly. It's phenomenal what you can do now. And with Teams, what we typically do, you can set up a channel or a different invite to the people that you want in a specific group. They would go into that group. Then we would definitely encourage, as we've been discussing, turning the video camera on, because now you are actually trying to collaborate and discuss things as a group. You know, Murray wants to know who's there, Tim wants to know who's there, and we can collaborate with the work instruction on the screen about the work scope, the details of doing that job, and drawing on lessons and photos, videos that we might need for the session. So that's something that we've pivoted with over the last 6 months and really used the digital technology available to continue to support clients with readiness activities, even though we can't get together physically. And as I say, Rachel, we found that there are numerous advantages to that. So there's a reluctance, but there's a growing appreciation that digital is here to stay. And I would hazard a guess or speculate that going into 21, as we get a vaccine for COVID and as we return to more free travel, we will see a hybrid. I think that there may be times where we accept that face-to-face is important, because I personally believe that team building is a contact sport. You know, pressing the flesh, shaking hands, being in the same physical space, I do believe is quite important to build a true team. However, a lot of the information sharing that we do, and it's important to do, can be done virtually. So maybe what we'll start to see is a hybrid, which is a real gain, because we wouldn't have seen that hybrid without this forced experimentation with the platforms available.
Yeah, so I guess from an efficiency point of view, for a lot of your clients, it's going to make sense as well. They don't have to bring everybody together, yourselves included. So they have more money to spend on operations and performance improvement.
I think that must be a massive thing, Rachel. You know, we're sort of laughing at it. You think, you know, the one that was done there, absolutely. You know, the one that was done earlier this week, Tim, when you had, what I think, in excess of about 60 people. Typically, just traditional way of doing that would have been 60 people flying in to a venue, staying in a hotel, all the associated costs, the time impact on that. This week they did it from their home. You know, that's, and we've been forced to do that. But I think that, like you say, it's going to revolutionize how some of this is done. I dare say some of it will still happen the old way when we get our freedom back, but this actually makes so much sense. And we're starting to see, you know, you and I have been discussing some of the operations production possibilities for this as well. You know, there's choke reviews, production limit stuff you can do. There's a bunch of sessions you would normally do that actually one of the the typical barriers were cost and the time implication for getting people to move around to come to these things. That, to some extent, it's not going away completely, but it's massively lessened. So it should actually make some of this stuff accessible, which is great for us because I think we're pretty far ahead of the curve for delivering this sort of stuff.
Right, so not only will it make more sense to do the existing activity in a cost-effective way, but it'll actually open up further avenues that might have been pushed to the side because of cost or because of logistics or what have you. So it kind of widens the portfolio of services that you can potentially offer one client.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of my last point on that, I think, having done some production technical limit stuff in the past and short reviews and stuff like that, typically the conversation when you're talking to the asset about it is, we need all these people together, where are we going to do it, how are we going to get them there? And it actually is typically one of the things that pushes it out, and it maybe isn't done as often as it should be. Mm-hmm. Doing it this way, perhaps, as you said, Rachel, makes it much more efficient. Therefore, maybe it's something we can do on a much more frequent basis.
Yeah, so it's actually part of a calendar almost of training, of personal development and what have you. Yeah. Well, there's one benefit to to COVID, but you have been out and about, I think, Tim, haven't you? Have you done any face-to-face?
I have, Rachel. Yes, I was over in Denmark in August time to support a client there with a leadership offsite. Okay. That was a window of opportunity where the travel restrictions were lowered, and the team was looking for our support. And actually, it gives me an opportunity to touch on something which struck me as you guys were discussing there, the opportunity to help virtually. The principle of accountability partnership and objective support is relevant whether it's face-to-face or virtual. And it's intuitively appealing to most of us. If you have a performance aspiration and improvement aspiration, there is no doubt that having an accountability partner to hold you accountable to the goals that you've identified and to the progress towards those goals. Equally, having someone who is going to call it like they see it and be objective rather than complicit in perhaps not progressing towards those goals. Those principles apply. And so, yes, I went across to Denmark to help a client and provide some objective support to their goal setting for the next financial year and to their process of picking through the last year to see where things went well and where things didn't go so well in order to learn the lessons and apply the solutions to those challenges for the next year. That can be done virtually. And what Murray's talking about there, I do think we're going to see an acceleration towards virtual coaching. So for offshore platforms, for production work scopes, for offshore drill ships, because of the technology, which is rapidly evolving and improving, and because of the saving in terms of cost, time, but also carbon footprint and other risks, I think we're going to see a lot more virtual coaching and accountability partnership and objective input going forward. And that will become a new way of doing things where we still get the benefits, but without some of the costs and the drawbacks. So I think it's an exciting time for this pivot, this transformation, this transition to applying the same principles, accountability, objective input, but without some of the concerns that went with that. For example, bed space. Often the pushback you get is, well, this is a discretionary service, we don't have bed space. Going forward, we can potentially mitigate that and say, you know what, we don't need to send someone offshore to take the limited bed space. However, we can still add significant value by coaching from onshore. All we need is to make sure that your frontline personnel are in a space where they can communicate and collaborate with that onshore support. And as I said earlier, with wearable technology and with greater bandwidth offshore, that's becoming more and more feasible for guys out and about on the decks.
That was actually something I was going to ask, because I'm never quite sure what the connectivity is like offshore, having never been offshore myself. And yeah, is that is it going to cope with a real rise in this kind of activity?
It probably depends what assets you're on, Rachel. I've actually sort of been loosely involved in a couple of trials a few years ago in some of this stuff, and some of what Tim's describing there, the headsets, they've got fancy iPads you can hold up to a vessel and it will actually show you what's in the vessel and levels. There's some really, really clever stuff out there. But yeah, one of the realities of the North Sea being that a little bit older, some of the bandwidth just isn't there. I think a bunch of the operators are investing to have that because there are massive benefits to it. But yeah, reality is they don't all have superb bandwidth. But it's better than nothing, and it is genuinely improving.
Yeah, and I guess that's also where that hybrid of some in-person contact, some virtual contact will come in, depending on the facilities available.
Yeah, and just building on what Tim said, I think it actually makes it a lot more efficient for both us and the client. Because I know in the past, sometimes it is actually really, really valuable to get out there and spend some time. But typically you're out for 4 or 5 days, but you're not necessarily need to be there for 4 or 5 days. It's just the way the helicopter rota works or the way other things tie in. You've got safety inductions to do. You've got a whole bunch of stuff to do that is not necessarily massively value adding. It is always good to see around and understand the environment and the people. But I guess doing some of this, at least if not all of it, lets us be very targeted and very specific. So as Tim was saying, some of the ops coaching or the coaching to the Wells teams, you can have a half-hour conversation or an hour's conversation and then go do the same with somebody else, rather than being on the platform, getting in the way. It's probably a smarter way to work, both for us and the clients.
So I guess Tim was talking a little bit about what he thinks is going to happen in 2021. From your perspective, how these changes, say we are all vaccinated and everybody can move about at will, how long do you think it will be before people settle down into a routine? Do you think there'll be a flood of people going, right, okay, we've missed our face-to-face contact for coaching in particular, let's just revert back to the old ways? And they'll probably not stick to that, as you've said, because they'll discover that it's far more cost effective and efficient not to do that. But do you think there'll be a bit of a response where sort of the requirement for face-to-face will shoot up?
Yeah, if I'm taking that one first, yeah, I think there'll be a bow wave to some degree. Yeah, I'm not sure it'll necessarily be massive, but I think some people, yeah, definitely prefer that face to face. As Tim says, some of the team building stuff, there's no doubt about it. It's far better when you're all there in person, in a room working that through. But I guess some of it will stay this way. I do think there's also there's more acceptance that this is going to be the way forward. Most of the operators I've been speaking to in the last few months do not expect to be going back to the office en masse. Okay. And there's one or two big players in Aberdeen that I don't think will be going back to the offices they currently have. So I think that is going to change. There'll sort of be a new,
post the virtual issue.
Yeah, there'll be a new norm to some degree. It will definitely be good to be able to get back offshore again and back out to site, and that will still happen. It's still immensely valuable. I know, for the coaches with Tim, they're out there again already, and then there's no getting away from the fact you need that. But I do think there's probably more of an acceptance for the sort of stuff that Tim and I do, that we could easily do it like this or in your office, whichever's going to work for you.
What about from a regional perspective? We've just talked about the North Sea there, but thinking about West Africa, for example, or South America, is there going to be the same kind of acceptance in regions where maybe the bandwidth, the general accessibility of technology isn't maybe quite as great as it could be?
Yeah, just following on this conversation, and to answer your question, Rachel, I think as long as there are people involved, there's going to be a need for people to visit and support them face to face. What's exciting for me, and this is adding to what Murray said, is we now genuinely have options. Before we didn't really consider alternatives to sending people out to then to go with the team. I mean, yes, you'd have email and you'd have correspondence, and video conferencing was coming in to some degree over the last 3 to 5 years. But the reality was that you'd be looking to mobilize someone over to support the team or to run a workshop. Now we've seen that we can make it work without necessarily sending consultants, coaches, mentors, technical experts to the destination location. It's not a must do, it's an option. So we can be smarter about that, picking up on what Murray said. In terms of some of the locations that we've supported in the past, Rachel, you know, you're right. It's going to depend to some degree on the connectivity and technology available there, the bandwidth. Although I do think on that point that the access to decent internet connectivity is only going to continue to accelerate. You know, we talk about 5G, we talk about 3, 4G in many of the developing parts of the world. So I think it won't be long before wherever you go, there will be decent connectivity. So I think that won't be too much of a problem for too long in most parts of the world. However, depending on the experience and levels of education and awareness of different work scopes in different parts of the world, then your solution orientation to that project will differ. So, you know, in the North Sea, there's no doubt that there are conversations about digitalization, which is about digital twins and about using a simulated scenario onshore to decide what the solution is for what's going on offshore. You know, we're going to see that rapidly accelerated in the near future. But I think, yeah, in terms of some of the far-flung parts of the world where we provide well management, ops management, and performance support, it's likely that the old normal will continue to be the normal for a while. But the hybrid approach and the smart approach of doing things virtually, of accepting that we don't have to send everyone by aeroplane to that location as often as we used to, there's no doubt that that will come into the equation in 2021 and beyond. So I'm excited because I think we've got a hybrid now, we've got alternatives, we've got options, and we've realized that we can be much smarter about the movement of people to support projects.
Okay, so let me put you both on the spot, since you are clearly advocates of the virtual way of communicating for coaching, for improvement. What has been, aside from what platform to use and how to work headsets and where to look and what have you, what has been your biggest learn when it's come to actually giving virtual coaching or performance improvement activity over the past few months? Murray, you go first.
I'm glad you said that.
That's not fair. Do you know, just as you were saying that, Rachel, I think the first thing that jumped into my head is preparation. Because it's quite easy to get this wrong. So an example for me, I was actually on a Teams meeting about 2 months ago, and I was sharing my screen. I was actually doing a presentation to an optimization forum that I created a few years back in Aberdeen, and I was doing one of the presentations. What I hadn't done, I was doing it on my personal laptop rather than my work one, and when I went to share my presentation, it wouldn't let me. So I had to give permission to share this. And my presentation was actually on the basics, the fundamentals, getting across, you know, some of the basic behaviors. And here was me not getting the basics right and unable to share my screen. So real big bit of learning, practice, preparation, get these things right. So yeah, I mean, it's easy to mess up. On the upside, it also shows that you're human. You know, so there you are, supposedly the expert, talking about something, and you managed to mess it up. So actually, you know, in the end, it broke down some barriers, and it was quite a successful presentation. But yeah, it shows the human side. But yeah, it's quite easy to get these things wrong.
What about yourself, Tim?
I'm going to cheat a little bit and build on what Murray said. It's my biggest learn as well. Sorry, that's not fair, is it? But it is my biggest learn because I had a resistance to the virtual means of collaboration, particularly for things like workshops, like DWOPs. You know, it's a little bit of a fear of new technology, and a resistance to change. What I've learned is that it's that life lesson. The best way to learn is to dive in head first, immerse yourself, fail to improve, fail fast. There have been a few challenges I've had similar to Murray. Certainly early on in lockdown, I was involved in some webinars where the unexpected happened, and you're working with technical glitches on the hop. And you know what, at the time it's uncomfortable. However, on reflection, it's the best way to learn. You learn fast. You realize, like Murray just said, you're only human, and you definitely have more empathy for others when there are technical glitches or sort of new user frustrations. So I would say that the learning is jump in, embrace the opportunity to explore alternative ways of doing things. It's a fairly transferable lesson for anything improvement oriented. Give it a go. Don't judge before you've actually given it a try, because here we are 7-8 months into lockdown, and having supported clients virtually with some of the things that I used to do face to face, I'm really excited, which I didn't necessarily. If you'd asked me 9 months ago if I would have been excited about using technology to deliver workshops, I wouldn't have been. But now I'm like, actually, it's valuable. And not only that, but there are some real advantages to doing it virtually. So not to say that we don't do it face to face, but yeah, some of my learns have been that there are advantages that you didn't expect from using technology. What about you, Rachel? What's your learning been? What's your biggest learning?
This is a fairly shallow thing to say, but I've learned not to go on camera without a full face of makeup. Sorry, but that's true. I don't know if that's the same for you guys, but certainly
Me too,
that's.
yeah.
No, truthfully, I think you're right. It's preparation, Murray, because you know, I've been involved in webinars with a number of different clients, and the clients who are quite happy to almost overdo it in terms of rehearsals they're the webinars that are the biggest success, because people aren't thinking, oh God, I don't know how to shift my slides, when do I get control of the screen? There's none of those little niggly things in the background which are what actually affect your front-facing performance. You can't concentrate on giving your best presentation, best conversation, best panel session, whatever it is, because 25-30% of your mind is on how is this actually going to work? What's the functionality going to be like? And I think it doesn't matter how many times you've done it before. It's always good. Well, like what we do, we come on early. You know, we make sure that everything's set up. We don't just all log in 5 seconds before we're due to go live. So I think it's not becoming complacent. And I think there is that danger, because you aren't walking out in front of a room of 50, 100 people, whatever it is. You are in the room that you've been sitting in pretty much for the past 8 months. And I think the complacency almost becomes natural in that particular circumstance, which is why we see all these photographs of people with a very smart suit and tie and then shorts underneath, because there is that element. You would never do that, ever, if you were in a live situation. Well, you might, but it would be unlikely. So I think there is that element of, I'm at home, things can slide a little bit, and that just can't happen when it's an online event like this, because it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, human error, all very good, but lack of preparation, it's not
so good.
acceptable.
I can see one of your preparations, Rachel's also having a vodka and orange.
Vodka and orange.
I've noticed the glass coming. Yeah.
Robinson's diluting, I promise.
Okay.
It's only 2:30. Give me an hour, you know. And then I'll be on the hard stuff. Great. Well, listen, thanks, guys. I think it's probably about time for us to wrap this edition up. And as ever, thanks to everybody who's been listening. And if any of today's conversation has brought up any questions for you or sparked any queries that you'd like to ask Tim or Murray particularly, then get in touch with them. You can do so via the Exceed website, xcd.com. You'll find their contact details there, or you can also speak to them on LinkedIn if you don't already have their direct email addresses. So thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you for episode 3.